Hello, welcome to another episode of Analog Adventures. My name is Crispin Jeffrey Franco, and I'm a co-founder of Stacks Book Club. Joining me tonight is author Chris Bohjalian. Chris is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 25 books, including his brand new release, The Jackal's Mistress. You may know Chris's work, The Lioness, The Hour of the Witch, Midwives, and The Flight Attendant, which was also made into a limited series starring Kaylee Cuoco for Max a couple years ago. He's also a playwright. He happens to live in Vermont and can be found at chrisbohjalian.com or at many of the social media sites that you frequent on a daily basis, including Facebook, Instagram, X, TikTok, and Goodreads. Chris, welcome to Analog Adventures. How are you tonight?
I'm thrilled to be here, Crispin. It's a pleasure to meet, if only virtually, especially since you've got such wonderful Vermont connections.
Yeah. So you're in Vermont. My wife's family is originally from Vermont, and so we have a little bit of connection there. We love the area. It looks out of your window, looks very Vermonty back there. We had 92 degrees today here in Southern Arizona, so we are like full on summer. Hopefully you had
Well,
a
we had
little cooler
42
day.
degrees here, so we were like full on summer for Vermont.
That makes total sense. So we're talking about the Jackal's Mistress tonight. Chris, can you tell our listeners about the Jackal's Mistress? What are they in for?
The Jackal's Mistress is a Civil War Romeo and Juliet, a harrowing love story between the North and South. It's 1864, the Shenandoah Valley, and a gravely wounded member of the Vermont Brigade, a Union abolitionist, is left to die. And a rebel woman, a Virginian through and through, finds him, and with two formerly enslaved people makes the decision that, as treasonous and dangerous as it might be, she's going to try to save this Yankee bluebelly, and we're off and running. What I find most interesting is that it is inspired by a true story. An article I wrote for Reader's Digest way back in 2003.
Wow, so this story has just been kind of rolling around in your head for 20 plus years now. What made you revisit this idea and make it a novel?
Yeah. Ah, was it really rolling around my head for those 19 years? Maybe on an id level, a subconscious level, but the article ran in 2003 in an era when I was writing books like Midwives and The Double Bind. I wasn't writing historical fiction. So it didn't cross my mind that there was a novel in this story. And 2003 became 2013, became 2022. And I was on the Lioness book tour in Richmond. And you really feel the weight of the Civil War in Richmond in ways that you don't in Vermont. I mean, the closest thing that Vermont had to a Civil War battle was a botched bank robbery in St. Albans in the northwest corner of Vermont, in which no one was hurt, and the rebels made it safely back into Canada. So it's 2022, and I'm in Richmond, and I really recalled for the first time this story I'd written almost 2 decades earlier for Reader's Digest. And it seemed to me in 2022 that if ever our nation needed a book about healing and hope, when two people with wildly divergent political views can somehow figure out a way to cohabitate, we're off and running. And so I thought in 2022, this is the novel I want to write. And in 2025, it seems even more timely than 3 years ago.
Yeah, I think timeliness definitely stands out in the story. We live in a political climate. We live in a country that is as divided as ever been in my lifetime. That may not be true for all of history, obviously. But the idea
Okay.
of
Can I
maybe
tell you a great story,
go
Crispin?
for it. Yeah.
Exactly about that. In 2017, I think it might have been 2016, but back then, I hear David McCullough talking to Terry Gross on Fresh Air. And Terry asks David, well, David, you're a historian. In your experience, in your research, has the country ever been as divided as it is now? And David McCullough laughed, and David had this great chuckle, and he chuckled, oh, well, Terry, there was that dust up in 1861, and 1968 wasn't pretty. That's a paraphrase, but you see my point that somehow history truly is not merely cyclical, but repetitive.
Right.
And hopefully we'll figure our way out of our current predicament.
Yeah, I am optimistic that we will. I think this book adds to that. I think this book provides a lens to see the commonality and the humanity in each other, which I found to be so uplifting for a story set at such a perilous time for our country and with characters in very dangerous situations from start to finish, really. Um, where did you first become aware of the story? How did you put the pieces of truth
Yeah.
and fill the gaps with fiction that is also based on truth? Like what is the process like for taking the scraps of a story or the bits and pieces of a story and then crafting that into a novel that reads as
Yeah.
smoothly and propulsively as this one does?
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I'm going to answer the second part of your two wonderful questions first. The reason why I love historical fiction is because when you're writing historical fiction, you can introduce people to subject matters that otherwise wouldn't interest them. To wit, in 2012, I wrote a novel called The Sandcastle Girls. And The Sandcastle Girls is about the Armenian genocide, the Ottoman Empire's systematic annihilation of 1.5 million Armenians, 300,000 Assyrians, and countless Greeks between 1915 and 1923. I'm a grandson of two survivors of the Armenian genocide. If I had written a memoir of my grandparents' survival, it would have been read by about 11 people,
Yeah.
and all of them would have been named Bohjalian.
Mm.
But when I write it as historical fiction, a love story, an epic novel, it introduced millions of people around the world to the horrors and the truth of the Armenian genocide. The Sandcastle Girls did something that I could never accomplish with a memoir or with a history book, and that is to get people involved with a subject matter that previously they hadn't heard of. So, the first part of your question, where did the Jackal's Mistress come from? How did I first learn about this tiny footnote to the Civil War? Well, this little book is the Vermont Brigade in the Shenandoah Valley, and it was written by Middlebury College's valedictorian class of 1862, Aldous Walker. By 1864, Aldous Walker was a major in the Vermont Brigade. He would leave the war a lieutenant colonel. In any case, in 1869, he publishes this really slim but lovely book about his experiences with his men from Vermont in the Civil War. In the middle of chapter 8, there's a 6-page anecdote about a member of the Vermont Brigade, a farmer from Westford, Vermont, named Henry Bedell Jr., who was left to die when General Sheridan's Union forces pushed deeper into the Shenandoah Valley. But Bedell doesn't die. A formerly enslaved woman finds him dying slowly in an abandoned rebel farmhouse, and she and the wife of a Confederate soldier, Betty Van Meter, make this decision. I would want a Yankee woman, of course, as that Yankee woman might be, to care for my husband if he was dying and bloodied somewhere far from home in Pennsylvania or in Maryland. So Betty Van Meter makes this decision to save Bedell's life as best she can, with no real hopes of doing more than helping him not die
Mhm.
alone.
Mhm.
But she does save him. And as a matter of fact, much to the shock of everyone in the Vermont Brigade, months later, she manages to cross Confederate lines to return Henry Bedell to the Union armor garrison in Harper's Ferry. Gary Sledge in 2003 called me up. Gary was an editor at Reader's Digest. And Gary, I've been writing for Gary for years periodically. And he said, I've heard this story in this little book about the Vermont Brigade about a Vermonter who was saved by a rebel woman. Do you have any interest in researching it and seeing if it's true? And of course, I fell in love with the story because of these two very, very courageous people. But I also love any story that reverses tropes. And the idea of a Union, a really smart, courageous Union officer suddenly so gravely wounded that he's lost one leg to cannon fire and a surgeon and most of a hand to cannon fire, um, is now greatly diminished. And the trope of the antebellum woman who lives and works at home was completely belied as myth in the story of Betty Van Meter, who not only ran her husband's grist mill while he was a soldier and then in a Union POW camp, but she performed this incredible act of courage, making a decision to save a Union abolitionist in the Shenandoah Valley, risking her life, the life of her closest friends, these two formerly enslaved people who still work with her around the grist mill, and her 10-year-old niece.
Yeah, that is an amazing way to just, yeah, fall into a story. So you have the end points, right? You know where the story begins, you know where it ends. What is your job then as the author of this story to fill those gaps for us as readers? And how historically accurate are you trying to be versus, this is historical fiction, right? This is not a textbook. This is
Right.
not it's not a memoir, as you said. So like how are you filling those gaps, and where does creative license take over versus maybe like fact? I've heard this saying that fiction contains truth, whereas like nonfiction contains fact. So while the facts of the story may not be there, I'm sure there's layers of truth
Yeah.
throughout.
Yeah. No, you're spot on so many levels. First of all, yeah, historical fiction gets at a different kind of truth than history. And I'm not a historian. The facts of my story, the basics of the world I build, must be accurate to the period. Whatever is behind the horsehair plaster must be authentic to 1864. But my characters, I can imbue with whatever sensibility is going to, I hope, keep you as a reader turning the pages. I mean, my
Mhm.
gosh, there's nothing I love more than telling myself I'm turning off the lights at 10:30, but still reading at 11:15 because I'm so in love with whatever book I'm currently reading. So, in a book like this, we know the outlines of Henry Bedell and Betty Van Meter's story. We know what Aldous Walker has shared with us. We know some of the letters that Walker wrote home, that Bedell wrote home. We know a lot about what it might have been like to be a lonely woman in Virginia doing a man's job in 1864. And we know that eventually Bedell was reconciled with his family. Whenever I would tell this story to Civil War historians, and I would ask them to help me probe and understand the veracity of it, they would always come back to the same question. Well, what do you think? Were they friends or were they more than friends? So, as a novelist, I love an epic love story.
Mhm.
I love an epic love story when the characters who are so ordinary in everyday life suddenly must be extraordinary. Novels like Atonement and The English Patient and Cold Mountain. So, when I was writing my Civil War love story, I knew it was going to be a love story in every sense of the word. We have no idea if Betty Van Meter and Henry Bedell were lovers, but in my novel, they're fictional versions. Vermont Brigade Captain Jonathan Weybridge and Libby Stedman of Virginia, well, I knew they were going to be lovers in every sense of the word. There is no record of Betty Van Meter ever firing a Colt pistol. Well, the Jackal's mistress in my novel, Libby Stedman, she is quite capable with a Colt pistol by the end of the book.
I mean, yeah, the cover art for those that are watching on YouTube and seeing this um, is so striking, and it gets at what you were talking about earlier about subverting the tropes, because the woman that's on this cover is not is not a damsel. Like this woman that's on this cover is getting something done. I think that's like very clear.
I
And so,
love the way you put that.
yeah, thank you. Like seeing, you know, seeing Libby and like the even the name Stedman, like, you created that name from somewhere, but there's a certain amount of strength and stability and like fortitude that's baked into the name Stedman that I feel like Libby inherits that, presumptively via marriage, but she embodies what that name feels like to me as a reader, and here in seeing what she's able to do when her husband is gone and keep the gristmill going and keep the family going. Uh, and she's doing all of the things that are expected of her at the time, but she's doing so much more
Yeah.
than that. And so that name just to me was like so evocative of what the character embodies, and that was a really nice match.
Thank you. And I have to give a shout out because I once knew a wonderful woman named Libby Stedman. She died at the age of 92 in 2022. And she was just an inspiration on so many levels. And I loved her name and was wondering if someday I would have the perfect character for whom to christen it.
Well,
And in the
I'm sure
Jackal's Mistress,
she's,
I do.
yeah, I'm sure she's honored by that. So I mean, the other like really evocative part of this book is the title itself, The Jackal's Mistress. Jackal is such a fun word. Uh, I think the combination of the title and the imagery that the book presents sort of like really jump you off as a reader into
Mm.
like we're about to get into something that feels exciting, feels harrowing. I think the story does do that. Tie in the fact that there is a very tender and it feels real. The love story between these two characters that you referenced as the story unfolds and as you start to figure out and kind of learn how love could blossom in a dire situation, it feels very earned and rewarding as a reader to see the
Oh, thank
character's
you.
progression. There's another character in the book, Libby's 12-year-old niece that lives with her,
Oh,
Jubilee. That
she's
character
my she's my favorite character in the
screams,
book.
yeah, screams off the page. Just she has so much energy and uh so much attitude in the best ways. Where did Jubilee come from?
I love kids who are smart Alex.
Hmm.
I love kids who can see through a grown-up's hypocrisy and because they have no filter, will call the adults out. I peopled a lot of my novels with kids like that. I think it was Brett Lott, the novelist, who taught me you don't want kids as furniture. You want kids as characters. And he was right. So among my favorite characters are Emily Shepard in my novel Close Your Eyes, Hold Hands. Um, the teenage daughter of nuclear engineers after a plant has melted down and just, devastated the state. Um, Characters like Alfred from The Buffalo Soldier and Hatoun from The Sandcastle Girls, or most recently Marissa Dowling in The Princess of Las Vegas. So I wanted a kid like that circa 1864. Here is what we know about the actual 10-year-old niece who was living at the gristmill when Betty Van Meter saved Henry Vidal's life. Literally nothing. We do not even know that 10-year-old's name,
Wow.
which gave me
Yeah.
absolute freedom to do whatever I wanted in terms of making a character who will, to go back to one of your earlier questions, keep you turning the pages, and a character who can be on message in a way that adult characters might not. And of course, she has to be authentic, which is the most fun. So at the beginning of the book, when Jubilee meets this recuperating Union officer, her grievance with him isn't merely that he's a blue belly Yankee, isn't merely that his army has her uncle imprisoned and her father fighting down near Petersburg. No, her grievance with the Jackal is this: he can't walk to the outhouse, so of course she has to clean his slop jar. He is not able to help fix what little food they have. They get to spoon feed him. And she, meanwhile, worst of all, has to give up her bedroom so that the Jackal can be in Libby's bedroom, since Libby believes that no rebel Confederate officer would dare look in a lady's bedroom, even for a possible bluebelly. In any case, Jubilee is a wash in grievances and I had a great time with her. I think she's a blast.
I mean, yeah, I thought she was amazing. I think that's one of like, I think that's, I personally believe there's a lot of ways that literature surpasses television, but the idea of kids, especially in
Yeah,
books, like there's just so much that can be, so much more that can be done with those characters, and putting an innocent set of eyes in this very, not innocent situation, and hearing her sound
yeah,
like a 12-year-old that would be just as angry about having to do the extra chores and give up her space. Like a 12-year-old today would have very similar gripes,
yeah.
if an unwanted house guest all of a sudden displaced them. So I just loved her so much. The story also contains Joseph and Sally, who are formerly enslaved people, who have been set free prior to the novel opening, and have made the decision to continue to work for Libby throughout the context of the book. Where are the challenges in writing perspective characters of that nature, and what was the decision that went behind having those characters be part of the story?
Um, I can't imagine writing an historically accurate novel about the Civil War that doesn't address slavery. I
Mhm.
mean, we are a nation built on two crimes, genocide and slavery. And those are obviously cataclysmic crimes. And the Civil War was about the fact that the southern half of our nation wanted an economy built on human slavery, and the other half didn't. And it was so clear in a book like The Jackal's Mistress. That's what it was about. That's
Mhm.
why in 2022, I was so excited to write the book. I was in Richmond. I was blocks away from me when a mere 2 years earlier, the statues of the treasonous rebel Confederate generals had finally been taken down. So it was absolutely clear from the minute I began this book that among my, 4 or 5 principal characters were going to be African Americans, formerly enslaved people. And so when I was thinking, who is Libby Stedman, my heroine, I wanted her to be an outsider. I wanted her to be not part of this farming community in the northern Shenandoah. And she's not a part of it for 2 reasons. First of all, she's from a different part of Virginia. Secondly, and more importantly, there is this. In 1859, a mere 20 plus miles away, John Brown had led his failed insurrection. One of the things that insurrection did was absolutely terrify um, white people in the Shenandoah Valley. They were deeply afraid, and you could see it in what would happen historically, obviously, in the next 2 years. So in the novel, in 1859, John Brown has his insurrection, and shortly after that, in 1860, Libby's soon-to-be husband inherits the farm and grist mill from his father, which includes 12 formerly enslaved people. He makes the decision to liberate them, emancipate them, all but to leave. And Betty Van Meter then marries into this family. The family that, in the eyes of its plantation neighbors, had committed this act of unbelievable horror. They had actually freed their slaves. That made Libby the ultimate outsider.
Right. So, yeah, then that comes through in the novel as well, and it creates an interesting perspective for Libby to live in this world where she's basically uncomfortable from all angles for all kinds of different reasons, and that
Yeah.
tension continues to build so well throughout the book. Because I know you have a couple of projects in the work on the film and TV side. Is that right? Is there another writing project in the works as well?
Um, I do some TV in the pipeline, and I'm not allowed to talk about it, but I'm
Fair enough.
excited.
Fair enough. Yep.
And my next book is done. It is
Wonderful.
actually already in copy editing. It is called The Amateur. It is set between 1978 and 1980, which, much to my horror, is also historical fiction. And it is about a aspiring LPGA golf superstar, a young woman who is spectacular, and just before leaving for college, drives a golf ball through the practice net at her swank New York suburb country club, instantly killing a classmate and caddy and derailing her life. And before you know it, we are deep in the punk scene in New York City. We are at a college she never expected to go to. And now, years later, it is being narrated by, wait for it, a novelist in her 60s who is known best for a novel about a midwife on trial for manslaughter.
Oh my gosh. Sounds awesome. Can't wait.
Thanks, thanks,
Uh,
Crispin. Really appreciate it.
Chris, we've appreciated your time so much tonight. Listeners out there, if you haven't picked up the Jackal's Mistress, head to your favorite local independent bookstore, grab a copy. It's an exciting, thrilling, tender book that fits the time that we're living in. So I want to say thank you so much for being here. And if you could leave us with one last thing, Chris, what's the last great thing that you've read? It could be anything.
Okay, can I actually name more than one? I actually
Sure,
love
let's do it.
for nonfiction readers, dive into Adam Higginbotham's Challenger about the 1986 space shuttle explosion. Just fantastic. Absolutely loved Sally Rooney's intermezzo. Clearly, I am obsessed with Irish fiction right now. Sally Rooney is the best. Also, of course, love Claire Keegan, and new in bookstores, Broken Country, also
Mhm.
by an Irish writer. I believe her name is Claire Luce Holler.
Yep.
Broken Country. It is one banger of a book, a mystery, a love story, a saga of deeply grieving parents, and still so much joy.
Awesome. We appreciate you so much. Thank you for those recommendations. Thank you for sharing your time with us. Best of luck on the rest of your tour for the Jackal's Mistress, and we'll stay tuned for the amateur.
Crispin, thank you so much. You're a blast. Great questions.
Thank you.